From temperature drops that freeze victims in place to biological overwrite that melts human bodies into hive mind biomass. Some control happened gradually through visions. Others required dragging someone into a steel mill and pumping their face full of toxic particles. This is the ranking of the Mind Flayer's control methods by pure intensity and horror, starting from environmental manipulation and building to complete biological assimilation. Level 1. Environmental influence. The Mind Flayer could manipulate temperature, air pressure, and storm activity without directly touching its victims, creating environmental changes that signaled its presence. Throughout Season 2, Will Byers experienced sudden temperature drops whenever the Mind Flayer was near. Joyce noticed Will's body temperature dropping several degrees below average when he was under the entity's influence. The Mind Flayer itself was constantly surrounded by massive storm systems in the Upside Down, featuring thick black clouds and red lightning. In Season 3, the Mind Flayer's return to Hawkins caused power outages and electrical disruptions across the town. When the creature grew stronger, these environmental effects intensified. These environmental changes served multiple purposes. Temperature drops weakened victims physically, making them more vulnerable to possession. The Mind Flayer preferred cold environments, and this preference transferred to its hosts. Will demanded his house be kept cold during his possession. Billy Hargrove got severe burns when exposed to direct sunlight after being flayed, showing the entity's aversion to heat. The electrical disruptions demonstrated the Mind Flayer's ability to affect technology and infrastructure, creating chaos that distracted authorities from its true activities. Environmental influence was the Mind Flayer's weakest form of control, but it established presence and created conditions favorable for stronger possession methods. The temperature manipulation alone couldn't dominate victims, only prepare them for what came next. Temperature drops and storms might seem minor, but they're just the first warning sign. Next up, we're looking at victims who could sense the Mind Flayer without being touched. Level 2. Sensory awareness. Certain individuals could sense the Mind Flayer's presence and movements without direct possession, creating a psychic awareness that functioned like early warning radar. After escaping the Upside Down in Season 1, Will Byers developed what became known as true sight. He experienced regular visions of the Upside Down, seeing the Mind Flayer watching him even though he was in the real world. These visions intensified throughout Season 2, with Will feeling tingles on the back of his neck when the creature was near. In Season 3, even after being freed from possession, Will retained this connection. He sensed when Billy Hargrove and Heather Holloway were flayed, feeling the Mind Flayer's presence through them. Will's neck-tingling reaction in Season 4 implies his connection never fully disappeared. This sensory link worked both ways. Will could sense the Mind Flayer, but the entity was also aware of Will. The connection functioned like a psychic surveillance system. Will knew when the creature was active, what it was planning, and where its influence reached. However, he couldn't control this awareness or shut it off. The sensations came unbidden, forcing him to remain constantly alert. This level of control didn't dominate Will's actions, but it prevented him from escaping the Mind Flayer's influence entirely. Sensory awareness provided victims with information about the Mind Flayer's activities, but it also meant they could never truly be free. The connection served as a monitoring system that kept victims tied to the entity. Sensing the Mind Flayer is one thing, but what happens when it starts manipulating your emotions and amplifying your worst fears? Level 3. Emotional manipulation and fear amplification. The Mind Flayer could amplify fear, trauma, and negative emotions to weaken targets psychologically before attempting possession. When Will confronted the Mind Flayer on the football field in Season 2, Episode 3, the entity used his fears against him. Bob Newby had advised Will to stand his ground and shout at his nightmares, not knowing the threat was real. The Mind Flayer responded by overwhelming Will with terror before infecting him. The entity appeared as a massive shadow looming overhead, inducing paralysis through sheer psychological pressure. In Season 4, Vecna's methods revealed this emotional manipulation had been part of the Mind Flayer's strategy all along. Vecna targeted victims suffering from trauma, guilt, and depression, using their emotional vulnerabilities as entry points for possession. Victims' trauma made them more vulnerable to entry points. By overwhelming victims emotionally, the Mind Flayer reduced their ability to resist. Will's brave attempt to confront his fears on the football field became the exact moment the entity chose to possess him. His courage made him vulnerable because he lowered his defenses. The Mind Flayer exploited this opening immediately. Billy Hargrove's years of abuse from his father created similar vulnerabilities. The entity recognized his broken spirit and pent-up rage, using these emotions to maintain control once possession occurred. Emotional manipulation didn't directly control victims, but it created the psychological conditions necessary for possession. By amplifying fear and trauma, the Mind Flayer weakened mental defenses and prepared targets for deeper control. Before you subscribe, let me ask you this. What would you do if something could see through your eyes and monitor everything you experienced? Because that's exactly what happened to Will and Billy. Level 4. Psychic Link? The Mind Flayer could see through possessed individuals and monitor events in real time, using hosts as surveillance cameras for gathering intelligence. Throughout Season 2, the Mind Flayer used Will as a spy. Everything Will saw, the entity saw. When Joyce, Jonathan, and Nancy questioned Will about the Mind Flayer's weaknesses, the creature forced Will to lie, claiming it didn't like heat when this was actually true. The Mind Flayer manipulated Will into sending soldiers directly into a trap in the tunnels, where demodogs ambushed and killed them. In Season 3, Billy Hargrove served the same surveillance function. The Mind Flayer monitored Eleven and her friends through Billy's eyes, tracking their movements and learning their plans. When Will sensed Billy's presence at Heather's house, it confirmed the psychic link still connected all flayed individuals to the hive mind. This surveillance capability made the Mind Flayer extraordinarily dangerous. The entity didn't need to physically follow targets because it could observe through possessed hosts scattered throughout Hawkins. Billy could interact normally with people while the Mind Flayer watched through him, gathering information without anyone knowing. When the party realized Will was compromised, they had to carefully control what information they shared around him. Every strategy session, every plan they made, the Mind Flayer potentially knew about through its psychic link to possessed individuals. Telepathic surveillance transformed possessed individuals into unwitting spies. Victims retained enough autonomy to function normally, but everything they experienced fed directly to the Mind Flayer. This level combined observation with information gathering, making it a critical intelligence tool. Psychic surveillance is terrifying, but at least the victim still controls their own body. Next level, we're looking at what happens when that changes. Level 5. Partial Possession. The Mind Flayer could possess someone's mind while leaving their body partially under their own control, creating a split consciousness where victim and entity coexisted. After being infected on the football field, Will experienced partial possession throughout Season 2. He could still function normally most of the time, attending school, talking with friends, and living at home. However, the Mind Flayer could trigger episodes where Will lost time and drew endless sketches of the tunnel system spreading beneath Hawkins. He experienced now memories that weren't his own, recalling events he never witnessed. Will's body temperature dropped several degrees below average. He demanded the house be kept cold and refused to take baths because the entity disliked heat. During interrogations, the Mind Flayer forced Will to lie about its weaknesses, speaking through him while Will remained conscious but unable to tell the truth. Partial possession created a horrifying split existence. Will knew he was compromised but couldn't stop it. He tapped out Morse code messages warning others to close gate using his left hand because he'd temporarily regained control of it while the Mind Flayer focused elsewhere. This demonstrated the constant battle happening inside possessed individuals. Will fought back mentally, struggling for autonomy even as the entity puppeteered his actions. The Mind Flayer didn't need complete control to use him effectively. Partial possession allowed Will to maintain his normal life while simultaneously serving as a spy and spreading the entity's influence. Partial possession trapped victims in their own bodies, aware of what was happening but unable to fully resist. They became passengers in their own consciousness, fighting for moments of control while the Mind Flayer used them for surveillance and deception. Drop a comment below and let me know. Would you rather be partially possessed like Will or fully taken over like Billy? Because both options are nightmare fuel. Level 6. Full Possession. The Flayed Billy. Full possession eliminated victim autonomy almost entirely, transforming humans into obedient servants who could only resist in brief moments of extreme emotional stress. On June 28, 1985, Billy Hargrove crashed his car near Brimborn Steelworks. The Mind Flayer dragged him into the basement where a creature made of rat biomass pumped toxic material into his face, fully infecting him. Unlike Will's partial possession, Billy became almost completely subservient. He kidnapped fellow lifeguard Heather Holloway the next day and brought her to the steelworks for possession. Together, they flayed Heather's parents, Tom and Janet Holloway. Over the following days, Billy and the other flayed recruited dozens more victims. The flayed developed superhuman strength and endurance, Billy withstood being thrown through concrete walls by 11 and continued fighting. They felt reduced pain, with Billy barely reacting when his arm was stabbed. Full possession granted the Mind Flayer near total control. Billy retained minimal autonomy. When Karen Wheeler approached him at the pool, the entity urged him to attack her, but Billy resisted and warned her to stay away. In the sauna trap, he briefly broke through, pleading with Max before the Mind Flayer reasserted control. These moments proved some humanity remained, buried beneath the possession. However, the entity dominated Billy's actions almost completely. He served as the prime host, leading the flayed army, and maintaining enough independent function to appear normal when necessary. Billy may have remained alive longer because he functioned as the primary host, while melting other flayed into biomass. Full possession eliminated resistance except in moments of extreme emotional connection. Victims became extensions of the Mind Flayer's will, retaining just enough humanity to make their loss even more tragic when brief moments of awareness broke through. If you're enjoying this breakdown and want more long-form content analyzing Stranger Things, check out our compilation channel for extended deep dives covering every season in detail. Full possession is horrible, but it still leaves the victim's body intact. The final level takes things to a completely different nightmare. Level 7. Biological Overwrite. The Mind Flayer could completely overwrite human biology, melting bodies into organic material that merged into a collective physical form controlled by the hive mind. In Season 3, the Flayed weren't just possessed mentally, they were biologically transformed. Mrs. Doris Driscoll and other Flayed consumed massive amounts of fertilizer and cleaning chemicals. These chemicals triggered reactions in their bodies that broke them down at a cellular level. The Flayed melted into puddles of biomass, their bodies liquefying into organic material the Mind Flayer absorbed. This biomass reformed into flesh creatures, including the spider monster that shared the Mind Flayer's distinctive form. These flesh thralls consisted entirely of bone, muscle, and cartilage from melted humans and rats. The creature grew larger as more Flayed dissolved and merged into it, eventually forming a massive proxy body that the Mind Flayer controlled directly from the upside down. This level represented complete biological assimilation. Victims didn't just lose their minds, they lost their physical forms entirely. Their bodies became building material for the Mind Flayer's physical manifestation. The spider monster possessed no individual consciousness, only the collective will of the hive mind. When 11 tore off one of its appendages, the creature immediately regrew it by absorbing more biomass. The biological overwrite was irreversible. Once melted, the Flayed couldn't be restored. They became permanent components of the hive mind's physical form. Even when Joyce and Hopper destroyed the gate and severed the connection to the Upside Down, the biomass didn't reform into individuals. It simply collapsed. Biological overwrite was the ultimate expression of the Mind Flayer's control. Victims weren't possessed or controlled. They were consumed and reconstituted as extensions of the entity itself. This level eliminated any possibility of resistance or recovery. The Mind Flayer's control methods ranged from subtle environmental warnings to complete biological assimilation. The simplest required proximity and atmospheric manipulation. The most extreme demanded physical contact and chemical transformation that destroyed victims at a cellular level. The pattern reveals escalating horror. Environmental influence was just presence and preparation. Sensory awareness created permanent psychic connections. Emotional manipulation exploited psychological vulnerabilities. Telepathic surveillance turned victims into unwitting spies. Partial possession trapped people in their own bodies. Full possession eliminated autonomy almost entirely. Biological overwrite erased physical existence. Each level built on the previous one. The Mind Flayer's method appears more refined with Billy, demonstrating the entity testing its capabilities, learning how to control humans. Billy's full possession in Season 3 showed near total domination while keeping the host functional. The biological override of dozens of Flayed citizens proved the Mind Flayer's ultimate goal wasn't control, but assimilation. In Season 3, the Mind Flayer focused on biomass assimilation to build a physical form capable of conquering Hawkins and eventually spreading beyond. Every possession served this purpose. Will provided intelligence about human resistance. Billy gathered more hosts. The Flayed became construction material for the spider monster. What made the Mind Flayer terrifying wasn't just the progression of control. It was the apparent strategic intelligence behind each level. Environmental changes softened targets. Sensory connections prevented escape. Emotional manipulation created vulnerabilities. Surveillance gathered intelligence. Partial possession tested resistance, Full possession eliminated it. Biological overwrite achieved permanence. Some victims retained awareness during possession, trapped inside their own minds while their bodies served the entity. Others were consumed so completely that nothing remained except biomass integrated into the hive. The difference between levels wasn't just intensity but purpose. The escalation suggests a strategy, though not explicitly confirmed. Will survived because 11 closed the gate, severing the connection before biological overwrite could begin. Billy may have remained alive longer because he functioned as the primary host, but both were always one step away from complete assimilation. The moment the entity decided they were no longer useful, it would have melted them like the others. The 7 levels reveal something crucial about the Mind Flayer's nature. It didn't care about individual victims. It cared about expanding influence and building physical presence in Hawkins. Environmental control, sensory links, emotional manipulation, surveillance, partial possession, full possession, and biological overwrite were all tools toward that goal. In Season 4, revelations about the relationship between the Mind Flayer and Vecna added new complexity. Stranger Things: The First Shadow confirms the Mind Flayer existed first and merged with Henry Creel's mind. Henry reshaped the Mind Flayer's particle form into the spider shape in 1979. However, Vecna's influence over the Mind Flayer during Seasons 1 through 3 is not fully confirmed. The exact nature of their connection and who truly controls whom remains ambiguous. If you enjoyed this breakdown of the Mind Flayer's 7 levels of control, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications for our Season 5 coverage when it drops.